Right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we should get started. We have a busy afternoon ahead of us, a very interesting one. My name's David Reynolds. I'm Professor of International History here at Cambridge. I'm also a member of the Archives Committee at Churchill College. I'm chairing the panel. Before I introduce the speakers and they talk, I think it might be of interest, just for those of you who have arrived this afternoon rather than this morning, to just, as it were, summarise the story so far in a few headline comments. We heard this morning about a very interesting political model for thinking about success as a leader, one that emphasised the skills of statecraft, of what was called cunning leadership, in other words, of electoral success, of winning elections as the essential point of any politician's career. We also had some suggestions about how that model might be politely put enlarged, less politely put critiqued, and that was an interesting part of the morning, emphasising, for example, the importance of, or the distinction between successful party leadership and successful national leadership. This is an issue that clearly matters. Another concept that was introduced was the idea that some leaders might be, or some politicians might be, successful transitional leaders of their party. In other words, repositioning them for a different era. Figures like Neil Kinnock, for example. We also heard the distinction between transactional leadership, in other words, brokerage in politics, deal-making, which clearly is important for electoral success, and the notion of transformative leadership. Transformative being changing the political landscape in some way or other, and that is obviously related to political opportunities to do so, circumstances, and so on. We were reminded that other countries have very different political cultures from our own, and that this model may or may not work so well for other countries. For example, the United States was described as an anti-leadership culture, meaning the separation of powers were very deliberately intended to prevent another George III, any kind of clear-cut, decisive executive leadership. We were also reminded in passing that American politics offer a different model of politics, which is politics as entertainment, but maybe we shouldn't mention that too much more, though it's very obvious at the moment. And we also, I think, particularly thinking about the German case, were reminded of the importance of foreign policy as a way of thinking about electoral success, not just domestic policy, not just the economy stupid, in the famous Bill Clinton mantra, and that leadership in that larger sense is about notions of authority, whether you bring in Weber or not, charismatic authority, ideas, action, putting ideas into practice. This is part of what effective leadership is. And that if you want to measure a leader's success, particularly transformative success, time matters. In other words, an electoral cycle is not sufficient to judge the success of a leader. Historical time matters, seeing what endures over time. So we had a whole range of really interesting contributions to the debate, building on the model that Toby James has set out. And what we have this afternoon are some case studies from British politics by three very distinguished historians of British politics in the 20th century and of particular political leaders. First of all, Richard Toye is going to talk about Asquith and Lloyd George, beginning of the century. Then John Charmley is going to talk about Winston Churchill, and John Campbell is going to talk about Margaret Thatcher. So several of the greats of modern 20th century British politics. I'll introduce them as we come along, but so let me just start then with Richard. Richard was originally here as a doctoral student, working with Peter Clarke, who it's very nice to see in the audience. Richard has contributed several major books on thinking about British politics, about the Labour Party initially in the 1930s, but a very important book looking at Churchill and Lloyd George before the First World War, their early relationship. And then he has emerged as a major scholar of Churchill with two very important books, one on Churchill's attitude to empire, and then more recently Churchill's rhetoric as a politician, as a leader, breaking new ground in thinking about that. So it's a great pleasure to have Richard here today. He's going to go back to some of his earlier ideas or his earlier field of interest and tell us a little bit more about Asquith and Lloyd George. Richard.
Thank you very much. As David said, I'm going to talk about Asquith and Lloyd George. Had you asked me, Alan, I would have been prepared to throw in Campbell Bannerman as a job lot, but you didn't ask. So let me begin with a very broad question. Is leadership timeless? Are there certain qualities of leadership that are eternal, irrespective of time and space? Now, there are plenty of books and articles and leadership programs that promise to offer to unlock the secrets of leadership, but can in fact leadership be taught? Now, I don't want to be overly sceptical about that idea. I don't want to pour cold water on the premise of why we're all here today, but I do want to be a little bit cautious about it, I suppose. So I think it may be possible that there are some constant principles of leadership, but I do think, as was mentioned this morning, that it's very important to take into account the roles of contingency and context. And so we can see, for example, that the qualities that served Asquith very well as peacetime Prime Minister in 1908 to 1914 really failed him during his period of war leadership, 1914 to 16, and arguably after that period as well. Similarly, the qualities that served Lloyd George so well as war leader in 1916 to 18 appeared to fail him in the period after 1918 in his post-war coalition, which fell in 1922, and also arguably continued to fail him after 1922 as well. Now, incidentally, there's been a sort of quite a long tradition of trying to rehabilitate Asquith as war leader, and I don't really go along with this revisionism. It seems to me that the revisionism really all seems to amount to saying, well, he wasn't really that bad, which I think is true. He wasn't that bad, but arguably he wasn't really that good as a war leader either. However, perhaps he was more successful as a peacetime Prime Minister in domestic terms than Lloyd George was as leader of that coalition after 1918. So I want to look at both what these two men had in common and the differences between them. I'm going to start with what they had in common. Well, the first point is rather a complex one. This is about the question of electoral success, which to some extent they both enjoyed, but we have to remember that this was, for both of them, heavily qualified electoral success, insofar as Asquith won. We tend to say that he won the elections, the two general elections of 1910, but in fact he had lost. In doing so, he lost the Liberal Party majority, the large Liberal Party majority that it acquired in just 4 years earlier, and was then dependent on the votes of the early Labour Party and the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Irish Nationalists, and that last point in particular had serious consequences for his government. So he didn't have an outright majority. And similarly, Lloyd George, although, again, we say that he won a landslide victory in 1918 at the end of the war, trading on the idea that he was the man who won the war, he didn't command a majority in his own right, even though the coalition which he led was extremely overwhelmingly dominant in the House of Commons, because in fact, as part of that coalition, the Conservatives had won enough seats to form an outright majority in their own right, and therefore they only needed Lloyd George as long as he remained useful to them. And by 4 years afterwards, in 1922, they were essentially fed up with him, or the majority of the Conservative MPs were, at any rate. Now, The second thing which they both had in common is that both, to a greater or lesser extent, were new liberals, as the phrase goes, and social reformers. And Lloyd George perhaps tends to get more credit for this than Asquith does, but we have to remember that the 1908 Pensions Act, which came into effect at the point where Lloyd George was Chancellor, had in fact been pioneered by Asquith as Chancellor. Lloyd George, of course, also in the pre-war period, was very creative in that partnership with Winston Churchill, at that time also a Liberal, in devising in particular the scheme for national insurance for protecting people against unemployment and sickness. Now, the third thing that they have in common, and I suppose one could argue that this is trivial, but nonetheless interesting, that they were both philanderers. In very different ways. Asquith had this long and passionate correspondence with a young woman called Venetia Stanley, and was sort of nobody really quite knows how far this relationship went, but he was sort of pouring out details of cabinet meetings into the long letters that he was sending her. Lloyd George had a series of sort of physically consummated affairs, most famously with Francis Stevenson, who was his secretary, who eventually he married after the death of his first wife. Now, in a sense, that may seem like a trivial point, but it does remind us that both of these men were operating in an era when press scrutiny was considerably less intense than it is today, and that Lloyd George in particular was able to get away with his private behaviour, which one may say was in fact none of the press's business or anyone else's business anyway, but certainly with the knowledge of many people in the press. Now, the fourth thing these men both had in common is that in different ways, I think in very different ways, they were egotists. And one can sort of see this in a variety of ways. I think that it manifests itself in Asquith's case in the fact that he very much wanted Venetia Stanley's attention, and that was something that satisfied his ego. As he got older, I think Lloyd George's egotism got even more intense, to the point where in the final years it was sort of really kind of a raging, out of control egotism. But I think that he did, they weren't necessarily, in the period that they were Prime Minister, necessarily disablingly egotistical. But the final thing they have in common, and this is, if you like, was a kind of a joint project, although they certainly didn't intend it that way, was that together in the 1920s they all but killed the Liberal Party. So in some ways these were very effective leaders, but both actually in due course became toxic leaders. Now, what are the differences between them? Now, apparently Asquith was laid back to the point of being languid. This is certainly his reputation, and is sort of summed up in his characteristic phrase that he liked to use, wait and see, as a method of political management. Now, many scholars have pointed out that, in fact, when he used this in parliamentary debate in the pre-1914 era, it was actually a sort of a threat that was offered to the Conservative Party, really, that rather than simply a method of procrastination. But Asquith's skills, which were in many ways extremely effective in peacetime, in keeping together in incredibly difficult circumstances in the pre-war period, a time of industrial unrest and conflict over Ireland, he actually managed to keep the show on the road. And he did this, he was able to nuance positions without seeming to get too involved in the detail. He could allow other ministers to make the running on the basis sometimes of a bit of a nod and a wink, and they would take the responsibility, but in a sense they also knew that they had his support, as long as they didn't run out too far ahead of what he wanted. And don't forget that this was the man who did succeed in leading the Liberal Party more or less united into World War I. Now, we may or may not think that was a good thing, but it was certainly something which took an enormous amount of political skill. And so I would say that in spite of this apparently languid exterior, we should not underestimate Asquith's ruthlessness. And that Lloyd George's comment about Asquith on 5th of December 1916, when he was about to succeed in equally ruthlessly really carrying out the coup that drove Asquith from 10 Downing Street, Lloyd George said of Asquith, "He won't fight the Germans, but he will fight for office." Now, that was brutal. It may have been unfair, but I think it does remind us, actually, that Asquith did have great political skills as a political fighter, although it wasn't always, his manoeuvres were not always obvious. He was actually very discreet and successful in that way, often, until the last. Lloyd George, by contrast, was much more apparently and obviously activist. In Stanley Baldwin's phrase, the famous Carlton Club meeting in 1922 that brought down the coalition, he described Lloyd George as a dynamic force. It was clear that Baldwin couldn't think of anything worse than a dynamic force. We have to remember, of course, his famous People's Budget of 1909, which brought about a major constitutional crisis, only resolved with the Parliament Act of 1911. And we got to remember that he was portrayed by his opponents in his efforts to tax landed wealth and to assault the privileges of the House of Lords. He was viewed very much, he was portrayed, at any rate, very much as a class warrior, if you will, the Jeremy Corbyn of his day. And his language and his rhetoric was very powerful, describing famously the House of Lords as 500 men, ordinary men, chosen accidentally from among the unemployed. He also remarked in his famous speech in Limehouse in 1909, "A fully equipped duke costs as much to keep up as 2 dreadnoughts, and dukes are just as great a terror, and they last longer." Now, again, in drawing the contrast between them, we can see that arguably Lloyd George was more inspirational than Asquith as an orator. He was somebody who certainly fully mastered the art of the public meeting, somebody who with but not only his skill in phrases, but his skill in terms of emphasis, his use of gesture, which he thought was very important, was clearly an astonishingly effective orator, although we certainly shouldn't underestimate Asquith in that respect. And we've got to remember that in 1903, the famous tariff reform controversy, when Joseph Chamberlain was touring the country, preaching the merits of protectionism, that Asquith would follow him from city to city and make an equally powerful and impassioned speech on the merits of free trade. And then I think my final point, to sort of try and sum up the differences in some ways, is a phrase used by Churchill in his book, The World Crisis, in which he suggested, when he was talking about the transition from Asquith to Lloyd George as Prime Minister in 1916, he said that the vehement, contriving, resourceful, nimble leaping Lloyd George seemed to offer a brighter hope, or at any rate a more savage effort than the Asquith regime. And I think there's more than an element of truth in that. Now, I'd be reluctant to come and talk to you about these two figures without bringing you some new data, some new information. And so what I bring you is a couple of quotations from the diary of Cecil Harmsworth, MP, who was the brother of the Press Lords, Lords Northcliffe and Rothermere, and also a Liberal MP in the period 1906 to 1922. And my Exeter colleague Andrew Thorpe and I have edited the diary for publication. It should come out next year. And so I thought it would be nice to give you one quotation from Harmsworth on Asquith and one on Lloyd George, because I think it describes quite well what was distinctive about them and also gives you a sense of the contrast between them. So the first diary entry is from the 2nd of December 1909, just after the House of Lords had rejected Lloyd George's budget. And Harmsworth, talking about Asquith, said, "The Prime Minister had a great reception when he came into the House of Commons, every Liberal member rising to his feet and cheering wildly. His speech was superb. He is by far the greatest parliamentary figure today. His fine, deep voice, as ever, lent tone and colour to a splendid oration. With his fresh, massive, clean-shaven face and fine white hair, Asquith suggests to me at times a pilgrim father. Then again, I think of him as Oliver Cromwell, whom he grows to resemble more and more every year, without the warts. The highest office and responsibility have made Asquith. Until recently, he was strangely undervalued, even by his own side in politics. His grand budget speeches, his noble oration on Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, and his speech and conduct since he became Prime Minister have raised him to what is easily the first place in the House of Commons." And then if we turn to Harmsworth entry for 22nd of May 1918, when Harmsworth, who worked in Lloyd George's secretariat, the so-called garden suburb, because these were the offices, the temporary offices that were established at the bottom of Downing Street, he wrote a long entry writing about his relations with Lloyd George and what Lloyd George was like as Prime Minister. So he said, "Those anxious radicals who have imagined Lloyd George as dominated in cabinet by the reactionary Tories," remember this too was a coalition government, Curzon, Milner and Bonner Law, have been strangely mistaken. On the few occasions that I have been present at cabinet, the wizard has ruled the roost with no appearance of challenge from any quarter. He is in truth the life and soul of the party in no merely conventional meaning of the expression. His vivid personality prevails in the cabinet room as in the world outside. An easier chief to work with in some respects it will be difficult to find. He is wholly unaffected and unspoilt by enormous success. I knew him in the dark days of the Boer War when he was certainly the most unpopular man in England, having opposed the war. I see no change in his manner now when he is, I suppose, the most popular man in the whole Great Alliance. So I think those are interesting to give us a sense of the contrast between the two. But it's also worth going on to reflect what went wrong in the relationship between Lloyd George and Asquith, and in the Liberal Party more generally after 1916. Now, I would emphasise that this was not a matter of a simple clash of personalities, because, of course, the two men had worked together effectively before 1914, and to some extent they were able to bury the hatchet, although one might say not deeply enough, when the Liberal Party reunited under their joint leadership in 1923. But cooperation after 1923 was rendered hugely more difficult by the fanatical devotion and mutual hostility of Lloyd George and Asquith's respective groups of followers. Now, we could argue about where the blame lay more. One might say that perhaps it was Asquith's followers who did more of the damage than Lloyd George, and arguably his wife Margot did him a lot of harm during this period, as arguably she'd also done earlier during World War I. But I think it's worth reflecting on the question of what the followers did, who sort of almost wouldn't accept that Asquith and Lloyd George were prepared to work with each other, and really were constantly trying to undermine the leader whom they opposed. And so here's a further question for you. If we do spend a lot of time talking about leadership as we are today, but why not also study followership? Because I think that, of course, most of us are never going to be in the position of being a sort of supreme leader, a prime minister, or anything like that. So the question is, how can one be an effective supporter without being a slavish follower? How can one best be a kind of a loyal critic? I really throw that into the discussion. Now, going back to 1916, I think that the moment when it all went wrong for the Liberals was when Asquith, at the point where Lloyd George had become Prime Minister, was refused to accept the Lord Chancellorship that had been offered to him. Now, according to Lloyd George in his war memoirs, what Asquith said when he rejected this idea of continuing as a minister in Lloyd George's government, what is the proposal? That I, who have held the first place for 8 years, should be asked to take a secondary position? Now, this isn't necessarily corroborated from other sources, so we may be sceptical about that, but certainly I think that it was a mistake for him to refuse to try to work in cooperation with Lloyd George, and if he had resolved to do so, then much pain might have been avoided. And again, one can see the contrast here with Neville Chamberlain, actually, in 1940, who did work loyally with Churchill, remaining a member of Churchill's war cabinet, even though he'd lost the prime ministership. So, finally, lessons. Can we draw any? Well, I would argue that the only timeless lesson of leadership is the need to adjust to changing contexts, or at least to show the ability to recognise that one's own personal recipe for leadership, however successful in its day, has a limited shelf life. And that is just another way of saying, and this is a good cue for me to sit down, that as a later Prime Minister put it, when the curtain falls, it is time to get off the stage.
Thank you very much, Richard, and introducing us to followers as well as leaders, and philandering as an aspect of leadership or not. We're now moving on to John Charmley, who's going to talk about Churchill. John, like Richard, has covered a huge gamut of British politics in the 20th century. He's written about foreign policy in the Lord Salisbury era at the end of the 19th century. He's written about Lord Lloyd and the decline of the British Empire, Duff Cooper. He's particularly known for two major revisionist books on Churchill, which were published in the early 1990s. He's also written on the history of the Conservative Party. So another very versatile political historian, and John is going to give us in 15 minutes his distillation of Churchill as a leader.
Thank you very much, David. Well, I shall be here. So I'm going to start with a comparison that might be thought to be a provocation too far even for a revisionist, which is by comparing Churchill to Jeremy Corbyn. It's not, I think, well, you'll judge, unilluminating from the point of view of our general theme. After all, in 1938, anyone predicting that Winston Churchill would have been the next leader of the Conservative Party would have been greeted, I think, with the same incredulity as the idea that Jeremy Corbyn would have succeeded Ed Miliband would have been back in June this year. Churchill, after all, had spent much of the previous decade rebelling against his own party. Clearly not quite as long as Mr. Corbyn managed, but the two men actually had about the same level of support amongst their fellow MPs. The two men both also formed pretty firm political views at a very early stage of their career and didn't actually change them very much across a long political lifetime. Both, therefore, held views which came to be seen as very unfashionable. They were regarded as being somewhat outdated, and this helped to make both men rather isolated within their own party. It also, and this was significant for Churchill and could be significant for Mr. Corbyn at one day, neither of them had much in the way of cross-bench appeal. Both men seemed far too extreme ever to lead their party, and yet both did so. We'll come on to a few significant differences in a moment, but one of the reasons for making this comparison is actually to warn political scientists and commentators against complacency, which they rather fall into quite easily. Those who dismissed Churchill as an outdated imperialist warmonger in the 1930s had a point. But they thought from the centre of the existing political consensus, and they failed to see how precarious such consensuses can be, or how a certain concatenation of circumstances could lead to the improbable becoming the inevitable. I think political journalists and commentators would be wise to bear in mind the words of the great Lord Melbourne, What all the wise men said would happen has not happened, and what all the damned fools said would happen has happened. If politics is a science, it is a somewhat inexact one. Apart from their respective political positions, which of course, if you see politics as a circle, they almost join at the far ends of it, the major difference between the two men, of course, lay in their experience of political leadership. Corbyn's has been on the fringes, essentially sharing solipsisms with his fellow solipsists, which is perhaps why so many academics I know seem to support him. It's terribly easy to take impractical but honourable positions, securing the knowledge that they're unlikely to be tested by the responsibilities of power. The Liberals survived for years on it, and look what happened when they came in touch with it. Was, of course, quite otherwise with Churchill, who had his first experience of high office in 1905 and who spent 17 of the next 30 years in office. And if he was out of office for most of the 30s, it wasn't contradicting his own view because pygmies ostracised him. It was because of a failure in his own political leadership. He twice tried to take the leadership from Baldwin, and he twice failed. And as Lord Beaverbrook once put it, there is no point taking a pot shot at Santa Claus, failing and then complaining you don't get a Christmas present. There are, I think, two main types of political leadership. What might be called to adapt Weber, bureaucratic efficiency and charismatic domination. Democracies, so back to context, tend to favour bureaucratic efficiency and distrust the latter, even if they don't actually get much efficiency, but they get a lot of bureaucracy. Churchill not only falls into the category of charismatic domination, he actually helps define it. But no political leader's style is formed in a vacuum. We can see from Churchill's own histories the sorts of leader he admired and upon whom he modelled himself. And I think this is an important point. Churchill was actually very much a self-made man. His career really is the triumph of the will to power. He was physically unimposing, he had a lisp. This was hardly the mark of the political orator. He had no great family fortune behind him. And yet, he succeeded. It was no accident, I think, that he fixed on the idea that oratory was the key to power. His father was, of course, his first model and a great orator. He greatly admired F.E. Smith and Lloyd George, and they all had something he didn't, which was an instinctive command of the English language. They were orators who could effortlessly command their audience. Churchill had to set himself very hard to work to be able to do that. Charismatic leaders, usually, not least in democratic contexts, require quite special sets of circumstances for them to triumph over the distrust they arouse. There were, in 1943, British candidates for the role of man of destiny. It was Churchill's success in establishing his own preference, which was war at all costs, victory at all costs, which ensured that the other two, Lloyd George and Oswald Mosley, never got the chance to explore their political preferences, which were, should we say, somewhat different. If it was the extraordinary circumstances of 1940 which brought Churchill to power when nothing else would have done, it was precisely those circumstances which defined the nature of his political leadership. A few caveats first. We should beware of falling into the many traps set by Churchill's war memoirs and his own mythology about the nature of those speeches in 1940. Evelyn Waugh was not alone in noting that not everyone was enthused by his sham Augustan prose, and they certainly failed to outline a viable strategy for winning the war. But, duly entered and noted, there can be no doubt that those speeches helped define his political leadership, and that all that hard work, mastering the orator's art, paid off. Because those speeches, if we read them closely, define actually a political platform. And I think much national mythology has been employed in obfuscating this. If it's a myth to think that Churchill's speeches were universally admired in 1940, it's also one to think that the political nation was united behind a policy of no surrender. If Halifax did have a stomachache at the thought of taking over as war leader in 1940, there was more than one reason for it. Like many reasonable men, he was horrified at the way the war was going and far from against exploring how Britain could be extricated from it. But as long as Churchill was there, he realised such a line of action would always have been subject to assault. So better, it was thought, to let him try and fail. When Pierre Laval commented in 1946, just after they'd given him a stomach pump before they could shoot him, that no one but a fool could have believed in 1940 that the British would not be forced to the negotiating table, he was not wrong. But Churchill was the one frontline figure in the Conservative Party who genuinely believed that Britain could win the war. Now, if we look at it logically, we know that his ideas were optimistic to the point of folly. America wasn't actually about to enter the war, and the RAF was in no position to bomb Germany into submission, even assuming one accepted the arguments of the bombers. But here we come to Churchill, the key to Churchill's leadership here. His view was not logical, it was emotional. He was an instinctive as well as an hereditary Whig, and he did not believe that English history was going to a situation where Hitler would dominate the world. Now, often in his career, his instinct and lack of logic let him down. Certainly, Gallipoli would be one example, nearly finished his career. But here he was right. And that is one of the things about political leadership you can't replicate. The charismatic model relies on the atavistic instinct that the tribal leader gets it right when lesser men hesitate. If the leader fails, as Hitler did, then the tribe is merciless. But if he's right, the rewards can be huge, as they were for Churchill in 1940. Now, as Churchill is not noted, I think, for his modesty, it's somewhat galling to have to contradict him on one of the few occasions when he was modest. But I think it's nonsense for him to claim that all he did in 1940 was to give the lions roar. What Churchill actually did was supreme political leadership. He offered a battered and bewildered population and a confused political class a reassuring vision of victory. He was able to communicate something of his own confidence to the nation. And that was an act of political leadership of the highest order. And it is indeed upon this that this college and the whole Churchill legend rests and must rest secure. Now, by the standards, many of the standards we saw this morning used to measure political leadership, Churchill was pretty useless. He took very little interest in party organisation. Indeed, he disliked the Conservative Party almost as much as it disliked him. A man who expressed surprise that Rab Butler wanted to go to the Department of Education in the war to wipe, as Churchill put it, snotty noses, rather than go to the War Office, might be said to have lacked some insight into the social and political dynamics of the war, something the 1945 election showed that the electorate had cottoned on to. But I think with Churchill, he gets a second big thing right. And that, I think, is quite remarkable. Latterly, Churchill's admirers and himself like to portray him as the prophet of truth. Well, Churchill very rarely read scripture and probably didn't remember that the fate of the prophets in Israel was not an enviable one. If Churchill was a prophet, then we can see there are examples where the prophetic model goes badly wrong. Very few of his admirers ever examined some of his greatest speeches, those in the 1930s against the India Bill. They're magnificent. Politically, they're disastrous, and they isolate him. So again, we see this problem with the charismatic leader. You put it all out there, you put it on 13 on the red at the casino at Monte Carlo, and you don't get it. Where Churchill is remarkable is he gets it once in 1940, and he gets it again in 1945-46. Churchill was a man whose political arteries had hardened by the 1930s. He was widely seen, and quite rightly widely seen, as a busted flush, as Lord Beaverbrook put it. Those on the Tory right who rallied to him over India were horrified by his change in the late 30s and left him alone. He lost his old followers, didn't pick up any new ones. More modern Conservatives, Duff Cooper, Anthony Eden, Rab Butler, all regarded his rantings in the Commons as the beatings of an antique drum. Nor were they alone. When it became clear Chamberlain had to go, neither the Conservatives, nor Labour, nor the King, nor anybody wanted Churchill. His great gifts were very great, but they attracted few to his side. And this, as it turned out, was not a disadvantage, because actually Churchill was better fitted to be a national leader than he was to be a party political one. After all, the only party Churchill ever felt wholly at home in was the one gathered under his own hatband. Ironically, for one who became the main victim of the coalition of 1931, Churchill had spent much of his career wanting one, only to find himself isolated. His Bob Boothby wrote to Oswald Mosley in the 31 coalition and said it was inconceivable that they'd all be left out. What would be said if Churchill, Bob Boothby, Harold Macmillan, Tom Mosley were all left out? To which the response was they'd say all the shits are in the same basket. But the coalition Churchill comes to lead in 1940 was the broadest there's ever been, from Red Ellen Wilkinson to Lord Lloyd of Delobran. And Churchill never wanted that to end. And indeed, had it not been for the Labour Party conference in 1944, there was no need for it to have done so. Most of the Labour cabinet didn't want it to go. They thought he'd win, as Lloyd George had won. But the coalition went because too many people in the Labour Party found Churchill unpalatable. They thought of him as a warmonger, and they continued to argue that both in the 45 election and for the next 5 years. I think David Lowe got it right in that famous cartoon of his where there's a picture of Churchill, the national leader, on a podium in Whitehall, giving consolation to the party leader as he walks away rather dejectedly. They may forget you, Lowe said, but they will never forget me. Churchill, like all charismatic leaders, defies all the normal leadership rules, because actually, in normal times, people like that do not become leader. It took a world war and then the threat of the Cold War to turn Churchill into a national leader. But despite spending a lifetime in politics, nothing could turn him into a political leader. His party was managed by others. His electioneering was, well, shall we say on a national scale, let's be polite, and say it was at best ineffective, although even Martin Gilbert, the one time you find Martin being critical of Churchill is that Gestapo speech where in the 45 election, when even Martin thinks it might have been a bit much. Minor tactical defeat, yeah. All the wise men in the 1930s had every right to think that he was a busted flush and he could never, in any circumstances, become Prime Minister. But of course, they failed to foresee how circumstances could propel the most unlikely person into the premiership, which might be a point at which, just to remind our current wiseacres, that for most of the things I've said about Churchill, you can say them about Mr. Corbyn. And anyone who thinks they can foresee into the future, if they'll just let me have their lottery numbers, I shall quietly retire. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. A charismatic leader who also, as you suggest, redefines the vocabulary of politics. If you think of phrases like finest hour, special relationship, Iron Curtain, summit, they all come from Churchill, and they are all words that we use and concepts we use all the time today. Our last equally distinguished speaker is John Campbell, one of our leading political biographers. John, as we were discussing at lunch, has covered the gamut of British politics in a very even-handed way, almost, I would say, ambidextrous or tridextrous, really, if that's possible. He's written on liberal leaders like Lloyd George. He's written on Tories like Lord Birkenhead, Edward Heath, and particularly Margaret Thatcher. He's written on Nye Bevan, a Labour leader, and he's written on sort of Labour turncoats like Roy Jenkins crossing the aisle. So today, John is going to talk particularly about Margaret Thatcher, who is, of course, one of the other British Prime Ministers, the 4 British Prime Ministers whose papers are in the Churchill archives. So, John, Margaret Thatcher.
I'm going to follow Richard's example. Right. Okay. If you measure political leadership solely by the winning of elections, then Margaret Thatcher is by far the most successful Tory leader of the 20th century, winning 3 consecutive general elections, the first from opposition in 1979, the second and third in 1983 and 87 as the head of a serving government re-elected by landslide majorities, an unprecedented achievement. No other Conservative leader comes close to matching this record, not Baldwin, who won 3 but also lost 2, nor Macmillan, who handsomely won the only election he fought as leader, but it was only one, though, of course, Tony Blair in 1997, 2001 and 2005 equalled it for Labour. I think also Mrs. Thatcher can arguably be credited with the party's 4th win in 1992. Even though she personally had to be sacrificed to secure it, John Major's government was re-elected on the back of her legacy. But, of course, winning elections is not everything. Both Lloyd George and Churchill, as we've heard, suffered heavy defeats but were still undeniably great leaders. What matters is what you do with power. In this respect, Mrs. Thatcher was exceptionally successful in 3 ways, I think. First, she redefined the philosophy and agenda of conservatism, taking over a party still steeped in the one nation, middle way, Keynesian, mixed economy tradition represented by Macmillan and Heath, and converting it within a very few years to a much more aggressively capitalist free market philosophy to which it still adheres. Second, she successfully implemented much of that agenda in government by privatizing most of what had previously been in the public sector, scrapping the whole paraphernalia of incomes policy and price controls, curbing the power of the trade unions, cutting direct taxation, opening the City of London to global competition, and generally liberalizing and deregulating the economy, creating a more dynamic economy, certainly, but at the cost of ever-widening social inequality, decisively reversing the trend of progress towards greater equality since 1945. So in the terms of what you were saying earlier, she was a transformative Prime Minister. And third, she shifted the whole argument of politics onto her terrain, so that after 4 successive defeats, the Labour Party, in order finally to be re-elected in 1997, had to ditch practically all of its traditional socialist or social democratic policies and embrace her new free market orthodoxy. Once elected, Tony Blair's New Labour reversed none of her achievements, but rather built on and extended them. In particular, she made the raising of taxes to pay for public services a taboo which no party has been prepared to challenge, though it may be that Jeremy Corbyn's throwback Old Labour will try. This surely is the ultimate success for a party leader. 20 years after she left office, Mrs. Thatcher still governs us from beyond the grave. Excuse me a moment. So how did she do it? First, it has to be said that she was lucky. Initially, in the succession of unpredictable circumstances which gave her the opportunity to become leader in the first place. As Ted Heath stubbornly refused to go, his senior colleagues like Willie Whitelaw and Jim Pryor declined to stand against him, and other potential challengers, Enoch Powell, Keith Joseph, Edward Buchanan, for one reason or another, ruled themselves out, leaving her to pick up the challenge. And then, as Prime Minister, she was helped by the poor quality and errors of her opponents, the Labour leaders Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock, the SDP defection from Labour, Arthur Scargill and General Galtieri. She was also lucky, since timing is everything in politics, to surf a global counter-revolution against socialism and collectivism, which was not of her making, but which she came to embody and to which she gave her name. She had a handful of like-minded senior colleagues, notably Keith Joseph, Geoffrey Howe, Nigel Lawson, but also a number of prominent journalists like Peter Jay, Samuel Britton, William Rees-Mogg, and others, and academics like Alan Walters, Patrick Minford, and others, spreading the gospel of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, who between them created the intellectual climate favorable to her radical anti-socialist politics. She did not initiate it. She did not even in any significant way contribute to it, but she harnessed it. She stamped it with the force of her personality, and she gave it her name. This, I would suggest, is leadership. It should also be remembered that North Sea oil started to come on stream just as she came to power, which helped crucially to cushion the social effects of her policies, and she was fortunate that the early crisis of her premiership, the Argentine invasion of the Falklands, which could easily have finished her, instead gave her the opportunity, which she seized with boldness and extraordinary courage, to wrap herself in the mantle of a successful war leader. But she deserved her luck. All her life she worked incredibly hard, and she had the courage and the self-belief to seize the opportunities when they came her way. As Prime Minister, I suggest she projected two qualities above all: clarity and determination. First, clarity. Everyone always knew what she stood for, and she invested politics with a strong and very rare moral sense of right and wrong, good against evil. She didn't try to appeal to everyone, but was happy to have opponents whom she set out unapologetically to defeat. She was openly on the side of her people, our people, essentially the home-owning, mortgage-paying middle class, against those, the feckless, the lazy, strikers, benefit claimants, left-wing councillors, anti-nuclear protesters, bleeding heart liberals, the Church of England and the BBC, whom she regarded as enemies within, and then by extension against enemies without, from the Soviet Union to General Galtieri to Jacques Delors. She was a class warrior at home and a cold warrior abroad. She despised consensus and saw politics as a battle to be won by inflicting the clearest possible defeat on her opponents. As she declared in a speech during the 1979 general election campaign, the Old Testament prophets didn't go out on the highways saying, "Brothers, I want consensus." They said, "This is my faith and my vision. This is what I passionately believe." And they preached it. We have a message. Go out, preach it, practice it, fight for it, and the day will be ours. This unusual clarity of purpose inspired tremendous enthusiasm in her supporters, the mark, I think, of a true leader. This sense that she had a clear mission enabled her various and sometimes contradictory objectives to be lumped under a single label, Thatcherism, and her followers to proclaim themselves proudly Thatcherites. Second, she projected determination that she would not be deflected from her path when the going got tough, a determination classically expressed in the defiant assertion in her speech at the Tory conference in 1980, "The ladies not for turning." This resolution reassured her sometimes doubting colleagues, advisors and supporters, voters, and crucially the markets, that she would not let them down, so that they kept on believing in her and supporting her through periods of difficulty and unpopularity. Again, this is leadership, akin perhaps to Churchill's blood, toil, tears and sweat. Actually, of course, her message was much more contradictory and her practice much more cautious than her rhetoric suggested. She was often privately uncertain, always felt personally insecure, and was instinctively cautious. She was indeed, as she liked to call herself, a conviction politician, but the second word was as important as the first. Her outstanding quality as a leader was the ability to project strength and certainty. But most of the time, her strong convictions were tempered by a shrewd sense of what was politically possible. On trade union reform, on privatization, on the NHS, and many other issues, she proceeded in practice much more cautiously than she liked to pretend. She was not a raving ideologue, but much more an opportunist than she or her admirers liked to acknowledge. She quietly backed away from strict monetarism when it was patently not working. Just as she backed off a possible miners' strike in 1981 when the government was not ready for it. Her good fortune was that the shifting economic consensus and the weakness of her opponents combined to open up the road ahead of her, so that more and more of her agenda became politically possible as she went along, more almost certainly than she ever imagined in 1975 or 79. Privatization, for instance, though a long-standing Tory pipe dream, was not mentioned in the 1979 manifesto and only gathered pace slowly after a cautious start. Then each successive privatization was furiously opposed at first, before becoming widely accepted and irreversible. Only, I think, on the poll tax did she get stubbornly ahead of public opinion with disastrous results. So, how did she project this image of unflinching determination and success? First, very early on, within a year of becoming Tory leader, she got a huge boost from the Soviet Army newspaper Red Star, which dubbed her the Iron Lady. Intended to be unflattering, but actually the greatest possible compliment for an untried female leader trying to overcome skepticism that a woman could be a strong leader. The name stuck and helped to establish her tough image early on. Then she was well served by her speechwriters. It was Ronald Møller, for instance, who coined the phrase, "the lady's not for turning," when she was at her most unpopular and vulnerable. Mrs. Thatcher was not a natural orator, not remotely in the Lloyd George or Churchill class, but she was good at delivering clear sound bites. She understood the importance of talking in homespun language of housewife economics, the virtue of thrift, the corrupting effect of debt, the importance of sound money. She never spoke about monetarism or medium-term financial strategies. She was brilliant at simplifying, arguably oversimplifying, complex arguments and ideas, investing them with a clear black and white sense of right against wrong, or truth against error. Third, she successfully courted the press, especially The Sun, which became her greatest champion, creating the popular image of battling Maggie, forever laying about her with her handbag, an image memorably taken up by Spitting Image, which began in 1984. Her loyal press secretary, Bernard Ingham, fed the press continuously with this robust caricature, presenting her as much more sure of herself than she very often was. Finally, she understood the importance of projecting a strong and consistent visual image through her clothes and her hair and carefully staged photo opportunities. She understood and exploited the singularity of her gender as the one woman powerfully dressed in blue or red or green among the anonymous crowd of grey-suited men. She never allowed herself to be seen, as other prime ministers have been happy to do, casually dressed, off-duty, or even on holiday. I noticed this morning that picture of Helmut Schmidt and Jimmy Carter and Jim Callaghan sitting around in their shirt sleeves. Mrs. Thatcher was never in her shirt sleeves. It was part of her image that she was always in her armour. But she was always, as she famously put it, on the job. This visual projection, I think, was a hugely important aspect of her projection of her leadership. But of course, she had failings as a leader too. First, she was not a good party manager. She was not interested in that side of leadership, and she did not unite the Tory party. Of course, it wasn't united when she became leader, but she made remarkably little attempt to unite it. By contrast with most other prime ministers, from Harold Wilson to Tony Blair and David Cameron, who devote great effort to balancing factions and squaring party opponents, Mrs. Thatcher made no secret of despising the so-called wets in her first cabinet, and even the younger ex-Heathites with whom she was obliged to replace them in her later cabinets, people like Douglas Hurd, Chris Patten, Ken Clarke, Kenneth Baker, always knew they were never one of us. But by her force of personality and her electoral success, she left the Tory party probably more united than she had found it. The younger generation of Tory MPs who came into Parliament under her leadership reflected her views, particularly her hostile attitude to Europe, far more than her colleagues in office had ever done. On the other hand, by paying it so little attention, she left the party in the country weaker and older, not least by undermining its traditional base in local government. Second, she was not a good man manager. She treated most of her senior colleagues abominably and contrived to quarrel with all her best supporters, Howe, Lawson, even Norman Teviot. She was very good and endlessly considerate with staff, junior officials, and some of her younger political favourites. But she was in fact a bully who humiliated less forceful colleagues like Geoffrey Howe, but was not able to handle strong characters who stood up to her like Michael Heseltine and Nigel Lawson. In the early days, she was very dependent on Willie Whitelaw, as she said, every Prime Minister needs a Willie, to manage the cabinet and the party for her, and it is arguable that it was after he retired in 1988 that everything began to go wrong. She was not loyal to her ministers, but frequently undermined them, both in private and through Bernard Ingham's briefings in public. The result was that when her popularity began to slide in 1988 to 89-90, they were not loyal to her. She had only herself to blame for that. Third, it can be argued that she was not a national leader, but always a fiercely partisan, divisive figure, even to many people a destructive figure, hated as much as she was loved and admired. Perhaps that is inevitable and necessary in a strong leader. With the possible exception of Churchill in the war, and even he, as we've heard, was not so popular at the time as we now tend to imagine. No political leader can ever command universal support. No one can be loved by everyone. But not needing to be loved was one of her greatest strengths, just as it is in many ways a weakness of those like Blair who hoped to bring everyone into their big tent. Mrs. Thatcher knew that she had only to win and retain enough support under the first-past-the-post electoral system to enable her to do what she wanted to do and take the country where she wanted to take it. This, despite adverse opinion polls for most of the time between her election victories, she triumphantly achieved. But she remained unpopular in large parts of the country, in fact in most of the country outside the south of England, and particularly in Scotland, so that though herself a passionate unionist, she played a major part in stoking the disaffection which may well end up by breaking up the United Kingdom. So her legacy is mixed, as we're beginning perhaps better to understand. Nevertheless, if the subject today is political leadership, Mrs. Thatcher was unquestionably, for better or worse, a leader.